So I've opened up a brand new Flutter project and you should just get this demo counter app. Now I'm just going to delete everything below the main function so I can teach you how to do this from scratch. So with any code base, everything always starts off from this main function and you can see we're just running our app. So let's just create our app real quick. Now in Flutter, there's two types of widgets we can create, a stateless widget and a stateful widget. I'm going to just go with a stateless widget for now. I'll explain more about the difference between the two later on. So the first thing you always need to do is just to return a material app. And this will just be the basis for everything. So if you save this, it'll just be a dark screen because it's got nothing in it. And in the home, we're going to just specify a scaffold. So this will just be a blank app and it will be the basis for everything else that we create. Now, one thing is you can see that debug banner, which is there just to show that we're still developing the app. Now, I don't like to see that banner, so I'm just going to set it to be false. Yep, so we'll just have a nice clean app. And the other thing is you see these blue squiggles. It's because they want us to put a const tag, but don't worry too much about that. I'll explain that a bit later on. Now, before we look at any app development, the first thing that we should do is to look at the programming fundamentals. So I'm going to teach this as if it's for people that have no coding experience at all. And I'm just going to get you up to speed on all of the basic concepts that we need to code. So the very first idea is a variable. So we can store different types of information into variables. Now, the sort of main variables I'm going to show you here. So the first one is a string. Now a string is just a string of characters, which in other words just means text. So we can say like, my name is Mitch Coco. And the next important variable is an integer. So like a whole number, say like an age, I'm 27. And then you've got double, which is for numbers that have a decimal point, right? So for example, like pi. And then the last essential variable we need to know is a Boolean. And Boolean just means if it's a true or false value. So it's just one or the other. So for example, is beginner? Yes, I'm a beginner, true. So these are the main variables that you'll need to know. There are other variables that you'll pick up along the way, but I think these four are the most important ones. And so now that we have information stored in different variables, we can now look at some basic operators. So the first thing is just the basic math operators. Now, if you know any level of math, this should be sort of familiar for you. So I'm just going to run through them anyway. So we've got the plus, the minus, we've got the multiply, divide, and also remainder. So if I just go through these, let's say for example, 1 plus 1 we know is 2. 4 minus 1 we know is 3. And in code for the multiplying button, we use the asterisk sign. So we know 2 times 3 is 6. And for the division, we use a slash symbol. And finally, this percent is for the remainder. So if I say like 9 divided by 4 gives us a remainder of 1. So these 5 basic math operators are pretty much all you need to know. So we've got the add, subtract, multiply, divide, and the remainder. Cool. So by the way, if you want to test any of this out, so I told you everything starts off at the main function. So we could just go and do a quick print here. Say for example, let's print hi there. And if you bring up your console and you restart this, you can see it'll just print in our console hi there. So if I just play around with some of these numbers, we could say 1 plus 5 and it'll give us 6. So you could say like 9 remainder 4 gives us 1. So yeah, we can always use some little print statements just to see what's going on. But now we have the basic math operators down. The next thing we need to know is the comparison operators. So for these ones, we have, say, starting with the equals one. So this kind of double equals, it checks if the two values are the same or not, right? So 5 equals to 5 is definitely true. We also have the not equal to, which is represented by the exclamation mark. So 2 is not equal to 3, that is true. We also have the greater than signs, right? 3 greater than 2. We also got the less than sign. And just like in math, we have the greater or equal to. as well as the less than or equal to. So hopefully you're following on so far. So if I just come back to my main function and just play around with it a little bit, if I print 9 is equal to 9, you can see it's true. Let's do another one, say 9 is not equal to 9. We know that is false. Sweet, which brings us to the last type of operators, which is the logical operators. So for this one, the first one is just the AND symbol, so AND operator. So this returns true if both sides are true. So for example, we could say is beginner, and the other condition is age less than 18 years old. So we had some variables at the top that we created from the beginning. So we can see that is beginner, we are true. And the age, I'm 27 years old. So is beginner is true, but age is less than 18 is false. So this one should be returning false, because for this to be true, we need both sides to be true. Now, there are situations where you might want to use an OR operator. And for this one, it's only true if at least one of the sides are true. So is beginner, we know that the left-hand side here is true, but the right-hand side is false. But since one of them at least is true, then this will return true overall. And then the last thing, which we kind of talked about before, is the NOT operator. So this one just returns the opposite value, which is this exclamation mark. So if I say exclamation mark is beginner, then we're going to return false. Cool, so if I try this again, now since we have our variables in this stateless widget, let's go down to this build method and we can just try to print some things here. So let's say like that OR operator. You can see it returns true. Cool, so we looked at some variables. We looked at the basic operators that we need to manipulate this information. And so just to sum up, just to make sure we're on the same page, every code base starts off in the main function. We're running our app, and this will build the widget down here. So let's continue this on. So now let me teach you about some control flow. So that's for right now. At the top, let's call this programming fundamentals. And now we're looking at the control flow. So control flow is how we're going to tell the computer how to get things done. So for example, the very first one that anyone needs to learn about is the if statement. So the way it works is if certain condition is true, then let's do something. So for example, we could say if age is greater or equal to 18, just print you are an adult. Right, so let's try this out. You can see, yep, if I restart this, our age is definitely above 18. So yep, we are an adult. Now the next thing is we can have an if else. So just check for a certain condition and then we can have all of the other cases. So just going off of our example, if age is greater or equal to 18, print you are an adult. Else, print you are not an adult. So this will just account for all the other situations. So just to show you here, if I say like I'm 5 years old, then it'll just go through the control flow and tell me that I'm not an adult. Cool, let's change that back to 27. So we looked at if else. And one more thing is an else if. So what this does is it just checks for another condition. Right, so the example I can give for this one is if your age is less than 13, then you can only watch G-rated movies. Else if you're less than 18, then you can watch G-rated and also PG-13 rated movies. Right, so this will just go in order and check the first condition. Okay, so if I don't qualify for that first section, then it'll go on to the next condition and so on. And then at the very end of all of this, you can have another else just to get the remaining cases. Right, so if none of those conditions are true, then at the very end, you can watch G, PG, and also R-rated movies. So if, else, and else if, these are the fundamental control flows for any programming language. So you're going to be using this a lot. Now, sometimes you might be using it too much. So for example, let's say we have a grade, like a school grade of B. And I just want to know by checking the grade, how well the student's doing, right? So we could definitely use an if statement here. Say like, if grade is A, then print excellent. Else if grade is B, print good. If grade is C, say fair. And then you can keep going down, right? Now, if you find yourself using too many if statements like this, it might be a better idea to use a switch statement. Just to show you, if I was to do the exact same thing, but with a switch statement, it says, okay, switch, and we're looking at the grade, and we can think about the different cases that this grade could be. The first case, it could be an A, and so if it's an A, then print excellent, and then we can have the case for B, have the case for C, and so on. And then similar to the very last else statement that accounts for all of the other situations, in a switch statement, we can just place that in a default. So if none of those cases are true, then just print invalid grade. So these two blocks of code do the exact same thing. But if you have a lot of cases, then it might be better just to use a switch statement instead of an if statement. Right, so yep, this is the general structure for a switch statement. Awesome, which brings us to loops. Now, just to sort of illustrate the need for loops, I like to think of an example. So I want you to imagine you have a box of 10 colored crayons, and you want to draw a circle with each one. So one way we could do it is we can say, draw a circle with the first crayon, then draw a circle with the second crayon, and then the third, and so on, right? But instead of giving the instruction like this, it's much easier for us to just say, for each crayon in the box, draw a circle. So this is what a loop is going to be used for. So the very first type of loop is called a for loop. And so if I was to just show you here, the requirements for a for loop is we have to have an initialization, we need to have a condition, and also an iteration, which sounds complicated, but if I just show you as a quick example here. For my initialization, I'm going to start with I being 0. So most of the time we just use an integer for this, and you can pick any letter, but I'm just going to pick I, and let's say, okay, starting at 0, and as long as I is less than or equal to 5, then keep incrementing and going through the I. So I equals 0 is our initialization, I is greater than or equal to 5 is our condition, and then I plus plus is our iteration, which I guess I haven't really explained that plus plus what that is. So coming back to our basic operators, let's add it on here. So plus plus just means incrementing by 1. It just means I'm going to add 1 to myself. And similarly, minus minus means we're going to decrease by 1. So these are kind of nice short way hand to do it. So for example, 5 plus plus is just 6. 5 minus minus is 4. So that's what that's doing, right? So that's our iteration. We're just going to keep increasing I by 1. So if I just show you like what this is actually doing, if I print out the I, right? Let's see what happens. So I'm just going to restart this, and you can see starting from 0, it'll keep incrementing by 1 until we get to our condition, which is being less than or equal to 5, right? So it will just go through the loop and print I equals 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if I make the condition say 8, then it's going to print it 8 times. Cool. So that's how you use a for loop on a very basic level. Now, one couple keywords that's going to be helpful is you can actually say something like this. We can say, if I is equal to say 6, then let's break out of this loop. And so if I just run this again, what happens is it's going to start at 0, and it's going to go through until 8. But let's see what actually happened. So we went 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then it just stopped. And the reason why it stopped is because we have this little check here saying, if I is equal to 6, then break out of the loop. And so it'll just stop the loop entirely. Now, similar to break, which just breaks out of the loop, we can also have a continue keyword. And what continue does is, if I just show you the behavior first of all, starting from our 0 going to 8, it'll print everything, but it just skips 6, right? So that's our condition here. So if I is equal to 6, then just continue and skip this current iteration. And that's what continue is saying. Cool. So using these, you can actually do a lot of things. Now I'm going to teach you one more type of loop, which is a while loop, which actually looks simpler. So in a for loop, you have to specify the number of times to loop, so that condition. But sometimes if you don't know how many times to loop, then you can use a while loop, which basically just keeps looping until that condition is met. Okay, so for example, right, let's say I've got an integer saying countdown being 5. So while the countdown is still a positive number, then print the number and let's go down. Okay, so this will keep going down until we reach basically 0. Right, so if I print this out, starting from 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then it just stops. Right, so you can also do loops in this way as well. Maybe I should make this look a little nicer. Let's put some lines here just so that our notes look pretty good. But yeah, let me teach you about functions. So we just looked at some cool blocks of code that get stuff done. Now we can organize these blocks of code into functions so that we can reuse them easily later on. So I'm going to create a method here. By the way, functions and methods, they are the same thing. And just to remind everyone, this main function is a function, it's a method. So the whole app starts off by running that main method. And so let's create a very basic one. So I'm just going to say void greet. And let's just say a message here saying, hello, Mitch. So when this widget gets built, let's call that greet method. And then you can see it'll just print it out. And by the way, the word void, what that means is void means that the function returns nothing. Shortly, I'm going to show you some functions that do return something. But this one for now, when it says void, all it does is it just executes whatever's in that function. So I'll show you in just a second a function that actually has a return type. But for now, let's keep it simple and just do void. So we have this very basic function saying greet. Now I'm going to show you how we can have functions that have some parameters. And so what that means is, okay, let's say we have another greet function here. And in this bracket, we can accept a parameter. And so the parameter I want to accept is a string called a name, right? And by the way, we should make sure the function is called something else, like greet person. Cool. So then we can say, all right, print hello. And then also let's just add on the name of whatever we're given. So coming back to our method here, we can say greet person, and you can see it's asking us to provide a name, right? And the type we need to give is a string, you can see here. So I'm just going to say, just as an example, if I say 5, it's not going to work. It's got a red squiggle because it says here that int, you can't give it to a string, right? So we need to give it a string. So I'm going to say, all right, let's give it Steve. And if I just restart this, then there we go. It's just saying, hello, Steve. Cool. Now, just by looking at this, we can see maybe we might need to add like a comma and a space. Yeah, that looks a bit better. But yeah, this is the idea of having some parameters. It's also called arguments. And so you can have many of these parameters as necessary. So maybe you can also ask for an age, right? Then if you're asking for another parameter, you can see there's going to be a red squiggle here that says 2 positional arguments are expected, but only 1 found. Okay, so we can just say 27 or 55. So that's how we work with parameters. And now let's look at a function with a return type. So I showed you and explained earlier that the word void means that the function is not returning anything. So now I'll show you a function that does return something. So instead of using the word void, I'm going to call this method as a type integer. And a very basic function here that we can illustrate as an example is an add function. So I'm going to say I want two integers as the parameters. So integer a, integer b, and I want to return the sum of these two integers. So let's store a plus b into another variable called sum. And you can see that the function has a red squiggle here, right? Because the void function from earlier, all it's doing is just executing the code inside. Whereas our add function currently, it's got an integer as a return type, right? So what that means is we have to return something, right? That's what it's saying here. We have to return an int. So you have to say return and then just return the sum. Okay, so how do we actually use this in practice? If I say add, say 3 and 5, the way we kind of wrote this right now is doing nothing because it's calling the function, but we're not storing this sum anywhere. So because it's returning a certain value, right, we can just print this value straight away, like 8. But it might be a better idea in these sort of situations to store that sum somewhere. So I could say integers my sum and call that add function, 3 and 5, and then we can just print my sum. So the main point I want to illustrate here is that this function add actually returns a value, right? And we can store it in our integer called my sum, right? This is different from the void, where the void just executes the code inside, but it doesn't return anything. Awesome. So now that we've gone through most of the basic programming fundamentals, I want to just show you some of the important data structures to be able to store our variables in a nice way. So the very first type of data structure is a list. So we can have like a list of numbers, say 1, 2, 3. And just to sort of connect this back to some of the earlier concepts that we learned, I'm going to create a quick method here called print numbers, and I'm going to show you how we can use a for loop to go through these numbers. So remember before, in a for loop, starting at the initialization of I being 0, we next need a condition, right? And so instead of specifying an actual number, I'm just going to say numbers.length. So just however long that list is, we're going to go through it. And let's just print the numbers for each of them. So if I come to my method down here and I just print numbers and I restart this, you can see it's going to print 1, 2, 3, right? Everything in that list. And just some notes here. The way you can access the information in a list like this is through the index. So in order, it starts off at 0. So for example, like numbers, and you get the number 0, then that'll return that first number. Okay, numbers 1 will give you 2, numbers 2 will give you 3. And so that's what I'm doing here in my for loop. We're just going through each of the numbers, and then the letter I is becoming 0, 1, 2, and kind of iterating through until we print them all out. That's useful. Now, that's pretty smart at sort of knowing what type we give it. Like we just said list, and we didn't specify what type of variables this list should hold. But you can manually specify it if you want, which is a good idea in a lot of situations. So we can say like list, and this list can only hold integers, for example. You can also have like a list that only holds strings, right? So for example, we can say a list of strings that contains names. So Mitch, Sharon, Vince. And we can do the same thing here. So we can say print numbers. We can have another method say print names. And just go through the length of names and print me out all the names. So yep, this is useful for all types of information. Cool, so that was just a list. And just to make this a little bit clearer, just so that you know the idea very clearly, I'm just going to change these to names so that you can see where the numbers are going. Cool, so that's how a list works. The next one I want to show you is called a set, which is very similar to a list, by the way. So a list is an ordered collection of elements, and you can have duplicates. whereas a set is an unordered collection of unique elements. So it has no duplicates. So we can have a set of strings and have some unique names. And so this will make sure that there's no duplicates and it's just a set of unique values. And then the last important data structure I want to show you is called a map. So this one stores key value pairs. And so what that means is, let's say I'm going to create a map called a user. We can create a user and say like, okay, the name is Mitch Coco. Age is 27. You can even have like more fields here, like height is 180. And so you can have like a list of information kind of as a key value pair. You're going to see this a lot throughout your app development career. And by the way to sort of access the information in a map is similar to how you access it in a list. So we could say like user, get me the name. And then that's going to print me the Mitch Co. And user, give me the age. It'll just print 27 and so on. So I'm just going to write some notes here just on how we can retrieve the data. Cool, now if you can understand everything I just showed you just then, that's the programming basics that you'll need to know. So the fundamental concepts. Now, if you know the basics and the fundamentals really well, so just the things I showed you just then, it can take you very far. And to be honest, if you can understand what I just showed you, then you've pretty much saved yourself a lot of time and money, because this is pretty much what I learned in my computer science degree. So if you didn't go to a university or something and you didn't get a computer science degree, don't worry, this is basically what we learned. And these ideas and concepts are not just exclusive for Flutter and Dart, this is carried over to other languages as well. So it's quite universal, these concepts. So you have to make sure you understand these programming fundamentals before we move on.